If you've started working on your medical school personal statement, you've probably realized it's no walk in the park. How do you avoid just repeating your work and activities section? How do you strike the balance between personality and professionalism? Can you present yourself as doctor material if you've never really worked with patients before? In this video, we'll be taking a look at a medical school personal statement example that needs a lot of work. I'll show you how to identify where the applicant has committed several common mistakes, and then I'll walk you through an example of a vastly improved version of the same personal statement, now fit for submission to top medical schools. Let's start with the medical school personal statement prompt. This will vary slightly depending on whether you're writing a personal statement for the AMCAS, ACOMAS, or TMDSAS application. The only real difference between the three is that you'll want to specifically write about your motivations for becoming an osteopathic doctor if you're applying through ACOMAS. TMDSAS also gives you slightly fewer characters. But for this video, we'll be focusing on the AMCAS prompt, which reads, use the space provided to explain why you want to go to medical school. Simple enough, right? And yet this simplicity, which leaves the door open to a broad range of potential topics, is precisely what trips so many applicants up. Thankfully, AMCAS provides some helpful insights about what they'd like to see within your 5,300 character response. On the application, they state, some questions you may want to consider while drafting this personal statement are, why have you selected the field of medicine? What motivates you to learn more about medicine? What do you want medical schools to know about you that hasn't been disclosed in another section of the application? They also mention that, if it applies to you, you can include details about special challenges or obstacles that significantly impacted your education or significantly subpar grades that you haven't had a chance to explain elsewhere. Please note that a few B's on your transcript or a poor first attempt on the MCAT probably don't warrant a mention in this essay. B's and fluke exam scores can happen to anybody, so rather than dwelling on them, you should let the rest of your application speak for itself and prove that you're a worthy candidate for med school. If you're the type of student who thrives on reviewing personal statement examples to gain inspiration and generate ideas, check out our Personal Statement Premium Example Hub, which contains hundreds of sample essays, plus analyses of each to help take your writing to the next level. Alright, now that we have a good grasp of the AMCAS prompt, let's look at a personal statement that has a lot of potential, but in which its writer has committed several of the most common personal statement mistakes that I lay out in our 8 most common medical school personal statement mistakes video. It begins like this. Your child is having a seizure. We need to get her to the ER right away, Dr. Deborah told the infant's parents. I stared in horror as nurses rushed to assist and we escorted the family downstairs. Dr. Deborah handled the emergency with expertise, allaying the parents' fears with reassurances that febrile seizures are typically not life-threatening. The child's parents, eyes wide and filled with tears, rushed into the waiting ambulance, and I stood in a daze as the scream of the siren faded around the corner and into the distance. I was in shock, and I'll never forget how I felt in that moment. Another time, while I was volunteering at Dr. Patel's neurology clinic, I was moved by an elderly patient's inability to write her own name on a piece of paper without dropping the pen. She seemed otherwise perfectly healthy, but there was an invisible block between her mind and her hand. She was visibly distressed, confused, and exhausted by her condition as she struggled to complete a task that would have been so simple in her youth. I was impressed by her determination to keep working toward her goals, and I wish there was something I could do to help her. A good hook can really draw the reader in, and this one certainly manages to capture the senses. We can almost hear the doctor's voice and feel the parents' panic. But within these first 2 paragraphs, we run into a few issues. First, the dramatic tone of the hook doesn't quite match the tone of the rest of the essay. The transition from a crowd of clinic staff scrambling to get an infant to the ER to an elderly woman struggling to write her name down is a bit jarring. The lesson here is don't feel the need to exaggerate or to think up the most dramatic event you've ever witnessed. If it doesn't fit into the overall theme and message of your personal statement, it'll probably just come across as overwrought. Next, notice how no context is given to explain when these events occurred or how much time passed between them. Were they a few days apart? A few years? Did they occur while the writer was in high school or in college? Providing chronological context for both of these events could strengthen this section of the essay and enable the reader to visualize your growth over time. Finally, both paragraphs focus almost entirely on other people, the doctors, nurses, and patients, rather than the writer themselves. It's good to include other people in your personal statement, but remember that you should always be at the center of your own story. Ask yourself, why are these events significant to me? How do they impact me? What role did I play in them? Let's move on to the next paragraph. In both of these situations, I felt totally useless and at a loss about what to do. I have always had a desire to help people in need, so when I'm not able to help, it really disturbs me. I want to be a physician because I'm passionate about helping people and I'm fascinated by medicine. I've dreamed of becoming a doctor for as long as I remember, and throughout high school and college, I've managed to consistently demonstrate my passion for this field through my involvement in extracurricular activities, volunteer opportunities, and shadowing. I also greatly enjoyed my neuroscience classes, which I took in order to better understand the patient cases I witnessed at the neurology clinic. From becoming president of the Future Physicians Club on campus, to shadowing various doctors, to volunteering at the pediatric clinic and neurology clinic, I've gained a thorough understanding of the rigors of a career in medicine, as well as the challenges and rewards associated with treating patients on a daily basis. At first, this paragraph seems like it might start to crack the question presented in a prompt. Why do you want to go to medical school? The writer claims that they've wanted to become a doctor for as long as they can remember, that they've always had a desire to help others, and that they're fascinated by medicine. But then what? The rest of the paragraph merely lists off activities they've already included in the work and activities section, leaving readers to wonder, why are you fascinated by medicine, and why do you want to help people by becoming a doctor specifically? There's nothing wrong with mentioning some of the same experiences that appear in your work and activities section, but if you're not describing the impact those experiences have had on you, then you're just repeating yourself and wasting your limited number of characters in the process. If you want to convince AdComs that you're cut out for the life of a doctor, tell them a story or stories that will allow them to arrive at that conclusion on their own. Don't just stop at, I'm passionate about helping people. Like a kid asking why the sky is blue or how caterpillars turn into butterflies, keep asking yourself, but why and but how, until you've refined your answer into something more substantial. All right, moving on to the final paragraph. Watching doctors work their magic is totally thrilling to me. Dr. Patel and Dr. Deborah have both had a profound influence on me, showing me how to remain resilient, devoted, compassionate, and inquisitive even in the most stressful situations. Thanks to their example, I've learned how to treat patients with empathy, patience, respect, and dignity over the past 2 years. Although I still lack experience in patient care, I'm confident that I have what it takes to bring comfort and healing to patients of all ages, walks of life, and conditions, and I can't wait to begin that journey in medical school. In conclusion, the applicant is so focused on trying to check all the boxes in the list of characteristics that make a great doctor that they end up sounding like a dictionary. Words like resilient, devoted, compassionate, and inquisitive don't hold much weight because anyone can use those words to describe themselves. Only applicants who have actually done the work, both in their extracurriculars and in their essay writing, can succeed in showing rather than merely telling about their best qualities. Taking what we've learned from our analysis of the week first draft of this personal statement, let's now review a new and drastically improved version of this same essay. As we go through each paragraph, notice that very few of the facts within the essay have been changed. It's the way those facts are presented and contextualized that makes this version so much stronger. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual about Mrs. Berry. Her kind eyes and laugh lines reminded me of my grandmother. After a few minutes, though, I noticed that her hands were trembling in her lap. When Mrs. Berry arrived for her first appointment at Dr. Patel's neurology clinic, where I was volunteering the summer after my sophomore year of college, I took her vitals. While we waited for Dr. Patel, we chatted about our shared love for gardening and her grandson's recent soccer game. Afterward, I asked Dr. Patel where I could find some resources on treatments for essential tremor. He listed a few research articles, then asked if I'd like to perform the motor coordination tests at Mrs. Berry's 1-month checkup to evaluate whether her new medication was working. I was thrilled at the chance to work with her. On the day of Mrs. Berry's checkup, I was hopeful. First, I asked her to balance a pen on the back of her hand, but it clattered to the ground. Next, I asked her to hold a glass of water, but the uncontrollable shaking expelled most of it. At this point, she was visibly frustrated. I encouraged her to rest for a few minutes, knowing that the stress of performing under pressure can exacerbate a tremor. I asked how her grandson was doing, and after she had relaxed, we moved on to the final exercise. I instructed her to write her name on a sheet of paper, but the pen jolted and skittered off the page. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Berry balanced the same pen flawlessly and wrote her name without hesitation. The transformation was so sudden that my younger self might have thought the only explanation was magic. In this draft, the writer has decided to stick with an introduction about their clinical experience, But this time, instead of opening with an over-dramatized version of the pediatric clinic scene, they provide a new, more personal perspective on their experience volunteering at the neurology clinic and working directly with Mrs. Berry. The writer not only shows an interest in Mrs. Berry's condition, but also demonstrates what steps they took to learn more about it, and even describes the active role they took on in Mrs. Berry's case. Without using a lot of empty buzzwords like empathy, patience, respect, and dignity, they show how they exemplified those qualities in their interactions with Mrs. Berry by getting to know her on a personal level and putting her at ease when she was struggling during the motor coordination test. By the end of the essay, the writer will have taken us full circle, describing in their conclusion how this experience helped cement their goal to pursue medicine. Additionally, note how they've begun to establish the chronology of the essay in this draft by mentioning this event occurred during their sophomore year of college. The next paragraph serves as a flashback, providing lots of background context as to how the writer eventually ended up at the neurology clinic. I've been interested in medicine since I was 3 years old, monitoring Paddington Bear's heartbeat daily with my plastic stethoscope. In high school, I shadowed a pediatrician, Dr. Deborah, and fell in love with the fast-paced environment of the busy clinic. By the time I started my freshman year of college, I knew I was interested in pursuing medicine, but I hadn't declared a major. The following summer, I started volunteering with Dr. Deborah at a pediatric clinic in inner city Los Angeles. One day, I was taking vitals for an infant when I noticed her eyes were making irregular movements. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, so I continued listening to her heartbeat. It seemed rapid. I scanned for other warning signs. Her face had turned red and her arms were starting to twitch. Then I panicked. Trying not to alarm the infant's parents, I told them I needed to consult with the doctor, hoping I was mistaken. As Dr. Deborah confirmed my suspicions aloud, the baby was having a febrile seizure, I watched the fear rise in the parents' faces. I felt underprepared, but I did my best to comfort the mother, helping her slow her own breathing using a technique I'd learned in an EMT training workshop. I couldn't say much to make it less terrifying, but I kept an arm around her shoulders as we rushed towards the ambulance, and she squeezed my hand in thanks before stepping into the van. That day, I was glad I'd noticed the warning signs and taken the right steps to get the baby the care she needed. But I wished I could have done more. I wished I had the answers to the parents' panic questions, and I wished I knew how to prevent seizures so that family would never have to endure such a traumatic event again. Here, the writer's extensive background context shows, rather than tells, that they've been interested in medicine ever since they ran a stuffed animal clinic as a kid. Then they go on to mention how the childhood pastime developed into a deeper interest during their high school shadowing experience. And finally, they reveal how their encounter with the infant who was having a seizure served as a significant turning point in their passion for medicine. Rather than dramatically recounting how Dr. Deborah handled the emergency and how the family reacted, the writer explains their own active role in the event. They don't claim to be the hero, but instead they show how, although their capacity for helping the baby was limited, they worked well under pressure, took the appropriate steps to solve the emergency, provided support to the patient's family, and later reflected on their newfound desire to help treat and prevent neurological conditions. In the following paragraph, the writer provides more chronological context, signaling that what comes next is a direct result of the childhood, high school, and early college experiences they've already described. I declared as a neuroscience major at the start of sophomore year, and I became fascinated by how our nervous system connects to nearly every function in our bodies. One of the first neurological disorders I learned about was hemispatial neglect, where damage to one side of the brain's hemispheres results in a lack of awareness of one side of a person's spatial field. When I saw drawings made by people suffering from this condition, which featured clocks, houses, and flowers that were only half composed, I found them both fascinating and horrifying. From then on, I knew I wanted to devote my life to understanding these kinds of disorders. This part of the personal statement provides clear evidence that the writer is, indeed, passionate about medicine and neuroscience. They don't go overboard with flashy medical terms, and they don't simply recite a list of their extracurriculars either. Instead, they provide enough detail about their specialized interests to convince ADCOMs of their deep commitment to furthering that interest in medical school. Now let's check out the final paragraphs of this draft. When I started volunteering at the neurology clinic the following summer, I was thrilled to see how the science I learned about in my courses was helping patients on a daily basis. There, as I met patients who suffered from migraines, epilepsy, Parkinson's, and various other disorders, I grew increasingly motivated to dig deeper into the topics I learned about in class. This, in turn, helped me more thoroughly understand each patient's case. My experiences at the neurology clinic were markedly different from my earlier clinical experiences because I now had the knowledge to fully appreciate the treatments I was witnessing. As Mrs. Berry, whose essential tremor had upended her entire life, wrote her name for the first time in years, her whole family started tearing up. I smiled and cheered along with them. She'd just undertaken a procedure known as deep brain stimulation, in which electrodes are placed at the thalamus and connected to a device placed in the chest. Once activated post-operatively, the device sends electrical pulses to the thalamus, inhibiting the very signals that cause the tremor. Mrs. Berry's life changed before my eyes, but it wasn't magic that had done the trick. It was medicine. Finally, the essay comes full circle. Remember how the first paragraph began with Mrs. Berry's sudden transformation from failing the motor coordination test to effortlessly writing her name just 2 weeks later? Here in the conclusion, the writer brings us back to that moment and reveals two new relevant pieces of information: the treatment responsible for Mrs. Berry's sudden transformation and the emotional impact of her transformation on everyone in the room, including the writer. Whereas the first draft of the personal statement left us wondering how the writer's experiences actually motivated or prepared them to attend medical school, in this revised draft, ADCOMS can clearly follow the development of the applicant's passion for medicine from childhood all the way through college. In this draft, it's obvious that the applicant doesn't just have a casual surface level interest in medicine. They describe how their clinical and academic experiences have instilled a deep, long-term interest in neurology and a desire to build a comfortable and trusting relationship with their future patients. And rather than making grand generalized claims that they already have exactly what it takes to be a good doctor, the writer answers the prompt, "Why do you want to attend medical school?" thoroughly and honestly. The personal statement is a big mountain to climb. It holds a lot of weight in every med school ADCOMS decision-making process, and it will require significant time and effort to get right. As you make your way through the drafting and revision process for your own personal statement, keep an eye out for these common mistakes. And remember, the earlier in your application year you start brainstorming and pre-writing, the more time you have to polish it to perfection. You can check out our month-by-month medical school essay writing timeline here to be sure you're staying on track. And if you'd like to see hundreds more personal statement examples along with an in-depth analysis of each, check out our personal statement premium example library. You can access it instantly using the link in the description.